2020 is finally over. So in this one, we're going to be looking forward and talking about 10 things you want to see that will come to the Elder Scrolls Online next year. Hey, it's Dan, and welcome back to Unified Gaming. Let us know what you think of these ideas, and I'd love to know what you think. Do you have anything different, anything else? Leave a comment. Now, kicking this off, we're going to jump through and talk about performance. As you can probably gather, performance is at it's a very awkward sort of state. They've done loads of changes in the year of the performance in 2020, and on the whole, it's kind of been downhill in all honesty from PvP. I've noticed obviously just more and more delays, some systems aren't working properly. I've noticed these are kind of creeping into Battlegrounds and Imperial City, and even into PvE when Greymoor got released. But in Markarth, I have to say that they have actually made some adjustments to make it better, but I just don't feel it's just quite there just yet. So for me, I've actually come up with some suggestions which I think could make PvP just more smoother, sort of server-wise, having sort of run servers before like Minecraft and stuff, and also just seeing how other systems work in the game. So my idea is this, and it's quite simple actually. There's a graphic on the screen to obviously help. If you look at Imperial City, that doesn't really lag because it's instanced, and what that means is that each part is its own little area. So if, say, one district's lagging, but you're in another district, you don't get this penalty of the lag from that district, which, you see that in PvE all the time. One region's laggy, another region generally isn't. And I think PvP is the same. I think what you should make is a cluster server. So the idea is that Imperial City is by itself, but Cyrodiil is its own server. And the server will be Greyhost. When you join Greyhost, the server is actually broken into 3 smaller parts, but it's all in the same campaign. The idea is that if you go from one server, you go to a milestone gate or to a bridge, there's a load screen similar to Imperial City. So you go through a door, you go over it or something, you can't be attacked for a minute or whatever it is. And by doing that, it just moves you to the other server in the same campaign. So from a player perspective, it looks exactly the same. Everything functions as it does currently, except that you can't destroy the gates. But what will be different is that if one server's lagging, so say you're in the Greyhost server 2, which is the yellow part, if that's really lagging, but people are fighting in Greyhost server 3, the people in server 3 won't feel any lag, even though in the same campaign. Whereas currently, you could be at the other end of the map, and you can get the lag because there's just a ball group causing delay somewhere else. So I think that would really, really help, and you see it time and time again in Imperial City, where that is just significantly smoother to play because it's smaller parts. So this is what I would suggest doing. Have a cluster server for every campaign, and inside each sort of cluster server, there's smaller ones for different parts of the map. From the player side, you don't see any difference other than hopefully better performance. And I've done this before on Minecraft stuff where there's been limited sort of resources, and that's caused issues there. So this does work for some games. It might work for this. The second thing I want to talk about is quite simple, and it's just the balance of the game. If you're somebody who does 1vx, you'll probably notice that most of the 1vx builds are typically stamina, and it's mainly because of the kit they have. And I'm not saying let's nerf stamina into the ground. All I'm saying is that Magicka needs just more tweaks and sort of polishing around the edges to make it more viable for 1vx. And equally, I think stamina needs some more tweaks just to make it more useful for group play. That in the past, when you had Resolve and Vigor, which it used to heal people, that was great, but now it heals yourself, which is still good. But I think they just need some more buffs. I think what they've been doing recently with some of the class changes to give some stamina options with stamina buffs and so on, I think that's a really good way of going around it. So I just hope that going forward, they just basically offset it so that way Magicka is still more viable for 1vx, but stamina is also viable for groups because currently it's just too polarized, in my opinion. As with number 3, and it's the elephant in the room, it's the proc sets. There's a graphic on screen, as you can see, and it's a little complicated, but just read it or listen to what I'm going to say. My idea is to make proc sets scale with weapon and spell damage and stamina and Magicka. And I've actually done some calculations just to get a rough sort of percentage for the developers just to tweak. So they want to go, what would work roughly? This is what they could try, and just polish around it. The idea is that if you have, say, Venomous Smite, it currently does 2,241 per second. It's quite strong. My suggestion is that you lower it down to 20% damage, so you take that 2,241 and you put it down to 448. So you literally lower all the procs to 20%. You then say every 250 Magicka stroke stamina, or 30 weapon damage or spell damage will increase the damage of the proc by 2%. And from doing the calculations on a typical build, so Shackle Breaker and a proc set, you find that the proc kind of matches the damage you get currently on live. But to make it more useful, I think they should also crit once more, which gives it much more use in PvE and in PvP. And on top of this, you actually don't have any wasted sort of traits. Like Venomous Smite, for example, you have 2 lots of crits, which is really useless for a proc build. Malakath is so good because it buffs procs, and procs can't crit anyway. But if procs could crit, it means that actually, if you had a high crit build, a proc could be really powerful because it could crit. But if you ran Malakath, you lose the ability for it to crit, so it does affect the procs in the bad way. So there's pros and cons to it: consistent damage or high burst with the crits. So that's what I would suggest doing. Make them scale with offensive stats, like I suggested, and I'd also say make them crit, so that way Malakath isn't always the go-to with proc builds. Now for number 4, I want to talk about health-based heals, and there's a graphic on screen to help you. In short, I think health-based heals should scale above 35k health really generously, but below it really badly. On the chart that I've made, this uses the numbers from live, so I've taken Arctic class as an example, but every class has a heal of some form based on health. Templars, Blazing Shield, Nightblade, you've got Dark Cloak, you've got Clanfear, DK's got the Coagulating Blood, Necromancer's got their Scythe. Like every class has some health based heal or shield or damage or getting health back in some way. And it's great for PvE. The issue is that, they made it to allow tanks to heal, but in PvP, you're now getting just damage dealers with like 35k health, 40k health, being able to have really strong heals and then run procs for the damage, which I think, that does cause a lot of issues. So what I would suggest is that have it so that if you're below, say, 35k health, the heal is really bad, like it scales really poorly, as you can see on this red line. But as you add more and more health over 35k, the amount of healing you get goes up really quick. So the idea that the curve is really slow to begin with, but above what is perceived as tank health, it goes up heavily. So from looking at like outcasthq.com, ESO builds, looked at a few other PvE players, so like Weibull, for example, and what I've seen is that most PvE tanks typically have 40 to 45k health. So what you can see with my chart is that the idea is that, when you get to about 40, 45k health, you have very similar healing to currently. And then when you're at 50k health, it's at what it is, like at max. As with number 5, this is something that I do feel is a bit of an issue, and it's an elephant in the room. Everybody knows it, but nobody talks about it. And for me, that is the weapon skill lines. In the past, the weapon skill lines made a lot of sense because typically class skills were very magicka focused, and stamina had to use weapon skills, and that was it. Now they're adding more stamina skills to the class kit, and they're also adding other skill lines, which again have stamina options. We're now at this kind of part where just stamina end up having an easier time to build a sort of effective PvP build. So what I've taken is the typical 2H meta, which is what people are using, and I'm just going to compare it to just the equivalent magicka specs and look at what skills would we need to have the similar kit in order to do well in PvP, let alone the damage is less on magicka as well, and it costs more typically. But when you compare Dizzying Swing to the magicka spammable, then it's not as good. You compare Rally to the magicka equivalent, which is Degen, it's not as good. Same with the Execute, same with the heals. And so what ends up happening is because of all these little extra bits, the bar space is very different. So if you look at the bar space for the top in stamina bit, this is on a sorcerer. You've got Dizzying Swing, Execution, and Rally. You've got 3 skills, you've got 2 bar skills spare on that bar to do what you want with. If you look at the back bar, you've got Hurricane, Vigor, and Streak. That could be Race Against Time. There's loads of snare removal things, Temporal Guard. So you've got 2 spare slots there. So you've got 4 spare slots in the kit on the whole. In order to have a comparable kit, so Burst Steal, Stun, Execute, Spammable, Armour, Snare Removal, Heal over time, you actually have to use almost all of your skills. You end up having 2 spare slots, not 4. And it doesn't sound like much, but having those extra 2 slots allow you to just add on more utility or more passive damage boosts like Camo Hunter. So you end up getting Minor Berserk in your kit, so now you're hitting harder, you've got more crit chance, so your crit heals are going to be more frequent, so you're healing better. And that's what Magic is lacking. It's all those auxiliary effects, along with which you're really sort of pushed for luck as a Magicka build, because your bar space is so heavily built around trying to get the stuff you need to be competitive that you have to make really awkward choices and lose out on stuff. So for me, I'd really suggest, given certain skills like degen, give it minor intellect, which is the Magicka regen buff. Look at Crush and Shock. Have it that if you use a Frost Staff, for example, it snares them. So that way you can link the element to snare. If you use a Fire Staff, it hits them with Burning, or do a False Pulse, for example. But tweak it so that way you get similar sort of effects with them. I'd also have it that with like Execution and Pulsar, instead of having it that they need to be burning, just have it on the initial 1702, that the 1702 number goes up. That's what I'd do. As with kind of Vigor, I think Vigor should heal people again, like AoE, but just make it so that it can heal you or one ally, whoever's lower. So that way it's like Rapid Regen, it heals one person, but you can use it to allies if you want all yourself. And that way you've got, comparable mag to stamp. But that's what I'd suggest, just change those things so that way just Magic has more spare bar space, because then they can add more damage. That's what they're lacking so far, is bar space. Number 6, this is getting more nuanced now, as you can tell, is Armour passives. Having looked at the Armour passives, I do think that generally Light Armour and Medium Armour, they are considered the damage armour types in the game. But what's really odd is that they're very different in how they play. So Light Armour has loads of benefits, as in cost reduction, all that stuff. But when you compare it to a Medium typically comes out on top. So if you look at Grace and Athletics, they're very similar, they're both movements, that's fine. You look at Evocation and Windwalker, again, they're to do with Sustain, they're both okay. If you look at Spell Warding, that's something that Magicka has, which Stamina doesn't have a counterpart, but Stamina have innately high armor. If you just add up all the armor rating from the medium pieces, you get 11,198 armor. If you add up all the armor rating from the light armor, you get 7,501. If you add in the passive, it's now 10,042 for just spells, by the way. So even with that passive included, it's still lower than medium armor. And so that means that light armor people are typically 3,000 roughly armor less, which is, that does add up quite quick. So I'd suggest changing it, which I'll come to in a moment. And then when you look at the kind of the crit passive, the crit passive for medium armor is actually better, ever so slightly, but slightly better nevertheless. Just maybe even those out, that's not a big thing. But the big one, in all honesty, is agility. I'm not saying nerf agility, I'm saying agility is more useful for PvP because it buffs your heals, whereas the penetration doesn't buff your heals in most cases, unless it's you heal like Burning Embers, for example. So what I would suggest doing is go into something like concentration, and instead of it being penetration, just have it as when wearing 5 pieces of light armor, your max magic is increased by 10%, and your spell damage is increased by 5%. So you get a similar sort of damage boost as you do for agility, but for the Magicka aspect, so you can build into Magicka and spell damage, which that's kind of the ratio people build anyway. They typically have more mag and less spell damage. So you get damage out of this, which buffs your heals, so then it's comparable. It's not as good, but it's comparable. I also think changing spell warding to be something like arcane protection. And what I would suggest is, if you go and change it so that it increases your armor by 528 per piece of light armor, that means that if you have 7 light armor, it's 3,697, which actually means that when you add in the base light armor, you get the same armor rating as full medium. So it means that light armor builds aren't as punished for being in light armor. And because it's magic, it just makes sense. So for me, I was just changing that to give light armor and medium armor some sort of just similar armor rate and similar defense. So in that way, they're just more comparable, because currently just medium armor has a few more positives, so that does actually make a big difference. And then the one thing that people, I do think should change is improved snake. I think that should move to Legerdemain or Thieves Guild. And I think they should change it to something like Fatal Strikes, an idea of mine, which increases your critical damage by 2% per piece of medium armor. See, the idea is that if you're on medium armor and you use Malakath, you don't benefit from this. So then there's, so it doesn't help with proc build, but it helps with high burst medium armor builds. So you get high crit damage, which really helps in the meta. So it just really gives medium armor that high burst, high playstyle speed it should be built on without the bulk, which is all of the other passives are all about movement. So this would make so much sense. So that's what I suggest with medium armor and light armor. Just tweak it out so they're both equally good, but in their own right. Number 7 now is a bit simpler, and this is just world and guild skills. I think the world skills, they're pretty okay on the whole. I like how the soul magic skill line scales with weapon damage or spell damage. There's a few inconsistencies with it, like if you compare the Soul Assault to Toxic Barrage. Toxic Barrage is more damage, like significantly more damage, about 50% normally, in smaller, like in less time. So I think there's inconsistencies between magic and stamina there. So I'd say just tweak certain things, maybe change Soul Magic, Soul Assault for example, to be all the damage in 4 seconds, not 6, so that way it's just more bursty, which that helps in PvP. I'd love them to make a Magicka Dawnbreaker. There used to be one many years ago. And this is what Magicka builds lack as well. They lack a burst ultimate. Most Magicka ultimates are typically telegraph and they're quite slow. Meteor, you put dots around the target, they see it coming, they block it. Yes, they're at range, so I'd say make it melee, so there's that risk reward that Dragonite, Templar, Nightblade, they're all melee anyway. Warden's melee to quite an extent as well. So they can all use this if they wish, and this gives them that burst ult they like. So that's what I'd suggest. Make a Magicka Dawnbreaker version, have it have a stun on it, or snare, or both. And that way you just got some options. And I would suggest, instead of having the one that gives you bonus weapon damage when you use it, just have it as either have a stamina morph, which is puts the dot on the Dawnbreaker, and the Magicka morph just converts it to Magicka, and it keeps a stun. So you lose a dot, but you get a Magicka version, or you have a stamina version with a stun and a dot. That's what I'd suggest. Number 8, you can see some charts on screen to help you out. This is from my, which class is good type video, breaking down the classes, good and the bad. This doesn't really factor in proc sets, so just do sort of bear that in mind. But, they reworked Vampire, they reworked Werewolf, and Werewolf is like stupidly stronger than Vampire. And so I think most people are now just using Vampire just for the undeath passive, but none of the skills are really used because they're ineffective. They generally hinder your kit and it actually helps. So you normally use it just for undeath with procs. So I would say they need to just tweak those two. They're just too far apart. And for the Werewolf, I'd say the self-heal needs adjustment. I've mentioned earlier on how you could adjust the self-heals to be more appropriate. So yeah, just adjust Werewolf to not be as broken in comparison to Vampire. I'd also love it for the Vampire ultimate to actually recharge whilst you're in form, similar to Werewolf. So that way, when you're in the Vampire form, when you use Vampire skills, it extends the duration, is what I'm thinking. So that way you're encouraged to be a Vampire and to use the Vampire drains, to use the Vampire spammable, because you're a Vampire. But currently you can be in Vampire for 20 seconds, or you can be in Werewolf for 10 minutes. I literally leveled up my Werewolf in PvE from level 1 to level 10 without coming out of Werewolf once. And that was like literally killing stuff, actually putting in the passives whilst I'm still in Werewolf form, supposed to navigate the menus and stuff, and still killing stuff and feeding. And I didn't leave it once. Like, it's ridiculous. Number 9, I think changing the PvP rewards to be more incentivizing. And for number 9, I'd say change the PvP rewards to be more incentivizing. So have the rewards of the worthy, but have it so they give you things like fragments, which you can then trade between one another, like key fragments that you get from Imperial City. And you can use this to open Undaunted boxes from the Undaunted people, or you can go to a dungeon and open a box there, but just some way that you can get a reward from PvP, like a currency, key fragments for example, and you can then use it to buy gear in dungeons, or even if you buy a box, it gives you a random chance. That way it gives PvP players a way to acquire PvE gear without having to do PvE. I think that's just, it's a good quality of life change, because as a PvP player, it's quite boring doing PvE again and again and again for the right drop. So just something I just think would help. And I think also with the PvP rewards, have it so that you can get gold materials, so that way you don't have to farm nodes and stuff, so people can actually make money, because in PvE you can make money by getting items and drops and selling them, like Mother's Sorrow for example. But PvP you're kind of really sort of out of luck there. Or make it simply that if you harvest resource nodes in PvE, you get like double drops or triple drops. Just something like that I'd recommend. And last on the list for me is just have other PvP modes. I'd love them for it to be like a dueling queue. So where you do PvP, you can go to Activity Finder, Duels, and it just matches you with a random person in the queue of a similar rank, if possible, or just somebody else on there. And you can duel them. Have it as a leaderboard if you like, but I think there's a big dueling scene in this game. and people have made it themselves because it isn't one that's built by the game. So just make it as a queue, and then it'll really promote that as another option, which PvP is really good in this game. So why wouldn't you? I'd also like, talking of dueling, is to have the dual option, have it as with CP or without CP. It's a really simple option, but there's so many times where you're like 810 CP and you might fight someone who's 500, and a mate that's joined the game. You've got a big advantage to them, so you have to reset your CP or lower it down to be equal. Whereas if you can just hit disable CP for this fight, job sorted. So that's what I would suggest doing. And last but not least, I'd like them to add in like team queues, but not just group queues, but like 12 queues. So the idea is that you can go as a guild into Battlegrounds 4v4v4, and you don't get any PvP rewards, but you can just do it to practice PvP. You can do it for fun, and you can have it where if you pick tank, healer, or DD, it puts you on that role at that team. So if you pick tank, it puts you on green team. If you pick healer, purple team, DD, other team. That way you can pick which team you go on, so you can sort out who's on whose team. There's no PvP rewards, so you don't get any kind of real, but they're boosting the farm, and it's none of that. It's literally a way to allow people to go into a PvP environment in a group and practice or just have fun as a guild. And there's lots of PvE guilds that don't do Battlegrounds or Cyrodiil because sadly there are seasoned PvP players that will just destroy them. So I think this is just a nice quality of life adjustment. But that there is my top 10. I'd love to know what you think, so leave a comment. And I want to say a huge thank you to those Patreons. But with that said, I'm just going to wrap it up here. So thanks for watching, guys. Take care, and bye.